All right, now moving on from cognitive dissonance to another aspect of social psychology, impression formation. And you can look at this chart here for some more information about it. I'm not really going to dwell on that. Rather, I'll focus on attribution theory here, which is a good kind of instantiation of impression formation, which seeks to understand the specific causes or antecedents of a person's behavior based on small samples of that behavior. Okay, so this is something that we do all the time with people who we know, with people we don't know, especially people we don't know very well. We tend to attribute their behavior to certain causes. Okay, that's why it's called attribution theory. We attribute their behavior to something. Okay, and you can attribute someone's behavior to or your own behavior. Okay, it applies to yourself as well as others, as you'll see. You can apply it to the situation or to a person's disposition. In other words, they're kind of who they are. Okay, so let me talk about that a little bit. It comes down to attribution biases. There are different ways of kind of describing this here. Different phenomena come from these various attribution biases. One is the halo effect. An initial positive impression is used to infer other positive characteristics. This comes into play a great deal in interview situations, especially face-to-face interviews, where if it's all about that what you've heard about before, where making a first impression is very important. Well, the halo effect really supports that. Okay, if you make a good first impression with someone, a potential employer, okay, or someone who's hiring for a business, that first impression is going to carry forth a long way because of the halo effect. Okay, they're going to, yeah, they probably glanced at your resume, but even if you have not that great of a resume compared to other people applying for the job, but you have a better interview than those people, you give a better first impression than those people, that's probably going to carry forth, it's not going to guarantee you that you get the position, but it's going to carry more weight in the mind of the interviewer than is the resume. Okay, that's basically what the halo effect dictates. Okay, there's also the assumed similarity bias, the tendency to think of people as being similar to yourself, even when meeting them for the first time. And self-serving bias, I just want to point out quickly, the tendency to attribute personal success to personal or dispositional factors. Remember a moment ago when I was talking about attribution theory, I said you can attribute behavior to the situation or to one's disposition. This is where you attribute your own kind of successes to personal factors, your own disposition, as opposed to the situation. We all do this all the time, okay, called the self-serving bias. You tend to attribute failure to factors outside of the self, okay? So if you are late to class, you tend to be like, well, it's not because I'm lazy, it's because traffic was bad, it was because my alarm didn't go off, I accidentally hit the snooze button, whatever. You attribute it to, and I'm not saying what's true or false, it's just across a wide variety of behaviors from ourselves, we're going to tend to attribute positive things to, hey, that's who I am, and negative things to, hey, it was the situation, okay? The exact opposite is what we do to other people's behavior, and that's known as the fundamental attribution error. This is really, really important stuff for you to remember, okay? Cuts to the core of social psychology, kind of like cognitive dissonance theory. This is another big one. The fundamental attribution error states, well, it's the tendency to overestimate the importance of dispositional factors, kind of who the person is, and underestimate the importance of situational factors on the behavior of others, especially for negative behavior, okay? But it works for positive behavior too. But a classic example I like to use is, hey, you get to class on time and someone walks in late, okay? And what's your first, assuming you don't know the person, okay, what tends to be people's first impressions about that person walking in late, if you were to ask them what they thought about that? People tend to be like, yeah, the person's kind of lazy, they're not on the ball like I am, getting here on time, they're lazy, they slept in too late, it's their fault that they're late, okay? Yeah, maybe not, okay? Maybe that person's late for legitimate reasons, their alarm didn't go off, they were stuck in traffic. Various situational factors could easily have led that person to be late, okay? Someone cuts you off in traffic, you tend to be like, that person's a jerk, okay? If you're using relatively pleasant language, not too flowery. Hey, that person's a jerk, right? But maybe they're just in a hurry because of a situation, Okay, they're late to work. I'm not saying that allows them to cut people off in traffic and speed and stuff, but we tend to assume that that person's a jerk rather than be like, maybe they're just late. Maybe, their wife is giving birth in the back seat or something. Okay, that's a little bit extreme, but, maybe they're going through something in their life where they're stressed about something. Maybe they had a horrible morning and they're anxious, they're depressed, they're stressed. Who knows? Maybe they have all kinds of reasonable situational reasons for speeding that morning, for cutting you off in traffic maybe, okay? It doesn't have to be who they are, but we tend to assume that, hey, they're just a jerk, okay? That's the fundamental attribution error, an example of it. Okay, in the next segment, I'll have to move on here. There's a lot of interesting stuff in social psychology, but I only have so much time to really dwell on these things. Next time, I'll get into social influence and groups.